Hey, welcome back. Business 150, Introduction to Management. And in this class, this is now module number 7, dealing with the topic of decision making. And in this particular video, as you can tell from the title slide, we are looking at the topic of behavioral elements. Behavioral elements in decision making. And what are we talking about here? In this fourth video, when we say behavioral elements, what we're really talking about is the kinds of things in human behavior, the kinds of parts of human behavior that routinely interrupt rational decision making, things that may influence us to be somewhat less or other than purely objective and rational. These are the kinds of things that are common when human beings need to make a decision under conditions of stress or duress, and things we should watch out for in our own lives when we're called to make decisions when there's a lot on the line. There's a lot at stake. So after this video, we hope you'll be able to contrast the real world, or what the textbook calls the administrative model, with the classic model that we talked about in the last video, and that you can examine the factors that may affect your own decision making. Let's see what we've got here then. Let's talk about behavioral elements in decision making. And really what we're suggesting here at the very outset is that what the textbook calls the administrative model, we could really just call the real world. In the real world, decision makers use incomplete and imperfect information. We don't have complete and perfect information all the time. So we use the information we can get. We are constrained by bounded rationality, and we tend to satisfice when deciding. And we'll talk about what those terms mean. What does it mean to be bounded, to be constrained by bounded rationality? What does it mean to satisfice when we are deciding? So let's talk about those things. Well, first of all, we typically are dealing with incomplete, imperfect information. We get the best we can get based upon our time constraints, the opportunity cost to get better information, our own level of research, and quite frankly, just our own simple impatience, how long it takes us to get good information. So many times we settle. We settle for the best we can get because we can't afford, or we're not willing to wait to get better information. We also work within the constraints of bounded rationality. What is bounded rationality? It means that human beings are predisposed, we are limited by our existing values, our own unconscious reflexes, our own skills and habits, the things that sometimes can powerfully make us who we are, maybe end up at the end of the day to be the very things that provide boundaries on where we are willing to think and consider options. And so because we have our own built-in biases, unconscious reflexes, and our own set of durable values, these constrain and bound us as we consider different types of options, dreaming up different types of alternatives. Sometimes we are simply not able to come up with all the possible alternatives because our own biases prevent us from thinking outside of the box. And then we tend to satisfice. What is satisficing? Satisficing is searching for alternatives until one is found that meets some minimum standard of sufficiency. So let me see if we can give you an example of this kind of compromise. Let's say that you have a pretty significant decision that you're trying to make, and the proper choice on this will mean a great big payday for your organization. But in order to meet all the criteria, it's got to have several different things going for it. It needs to be able, for instance, let's say the option has to be able to work with just the staff you have on hand. You do not have the time or the budget to hire anyone else. There's a constraint. What else? It also needs to be able to work within the budget constraints that already exist for the approved budget. You're not going to be able to request more money. Okay, so there's a capital restraint. What else does it have to work? Has to work with these 3 vendors and no one else, because that's who the contracts are signed with. Okay, so you got to work with those vendors, and each of those vendors has its own set of constraints and presuppositions and difficulty in working with them, quite frankly, right? So you've got a little bit of navigation to do there. You also have a timeline. It has to be delivered by this particular date in this particular month. And it's got to be able to meet this client's satisfactions. And you're not really sure even what their functional requirements are, but you know it's got to satisfy them as well. Okay, so you got this relatively long checklist of must-haves for any solution that you might be worthy or willing to consider. So you got this checklist in front of you. And now you go through your options and you find an option that seems like it might be viable. And so you start going through it and you start having to do a little bit of research to really answer all of these questions definitively. And you find out after you do your research about option number one, hey, it meets this one and it meets this one. It doesn't meet this one. We got to toss it. It's not really going to work for us. Okay, so that's the first option, gone. Next option, you're looking at the next option, and it took you a week to come up with this option, and now it takes you another week to do the research in order to find out, let's see, it meets this criteria, and it meets this criteria. Really meets this criteria. Man, it doesn't work with this criteria. Okay, that one's gone. Well, think about this, how the increasing level of impatience and frustration, if you go through another option, got to toss it. A fourth option, not going to work. A fifth option, got to toss it. And now you're starting to get really impatient and anxious. And so the very next option, it happens to check off all of the boxes. Does that mean that it's the best option? No, it just means it's the first one that you can really get all the way through the evaluation process, and it's still a possible candidate. Well, human nature and Satisficing suggests that from time to time, we just go with that option because it's the path of least resistance. It's the first one that actually met all the required requisite criteria. So I'm just going to go with it. I don't have time. I don't have the patience. I don't want to spend any more time researching this stuff. Let's just go with it. We'll go with it. We'll hope for the best. Yeah, sometimes we do make business decisions that way. We satisfice rather than continuing down the path of finding the optimal solution. Well, that's what this is all talking about. What else happens? Well, in some settings, you can see here on the slide, a coalition of political forces gets in the way. A coalition of political forces, an informal alliance that wants to make sure that their goals are also met in this decision. Sometimes decisions are made on the basis of intuition, this innate belief about something that maybe we don't go through the real rigor of conscious deliberation. My gut tells me this is the best way to go. I'm just going to go with it. Sometimes we fall prey to what we sometimes call the escalation of commitment, when managers stay with a decision even when it's proving to be the wrong decision. The results aren't happening. The results are subpar, but I'm still going to stick with this decision. And all of this may be driven by an individual manager's personal risk propensity, the extent to which a decision maker is willing to gamble when introducing a decision. This, of course, is very tightly bound up in one individual's personal comfort level when the risk tolerance. But let's be honest, some decision makers are willing to gamble more often than not only other decision makers, but quite frankly, gamble more often and in different ways than what the organization would really like to be done. And then the last matter that we'll quickly consider, we've already spent a great deal of time talking about ethics in a previous module, but let's be honest, some decision makers in business may demonstrate a different level of personal ethics in their decision making than others. All of these things affect and influence the quality of decision making by individual managers, whether they are swayed or influenced by a coalition of political forces, how much they rely upon intuition and how much they rely upon intuition as a substitute for conscious, logical, objective deliberation. How much do they tend to stick with the wrong decision simply because of pride, simply because of ego, simply because they don't want to be proven wrong? How much are they introducing the whole idea of gambling into their decisions on a regular basis? And how kind of personal ethics do they demonstrate in the decision-making process? All of these things are incorporated into this administrative model, or the reality of how some decisions are actually made in reality in business settings, other than the classic model. So you can see here, as we contrast this with the classic model from the previous lecture, the administrative model suggests when faced with a decision situation, managers actually use incomplete and imperfect information. They're constrained by bounded rationality. They tend to satisfice, and they end up with a decision that may or may not serve the interests of the organization. And so we introduced these two models, these two somewhat competing models on how decisions get made for your consideration, for you to think about how much your own decision-making really follows after the classic model, but have there ever been decisions you've made that, if you're honest with yourself, they really sort of fit this administrative model more? Things for us to think about as we consider how to get better at making decisions, and perhaps for some of us who will someday be making managerial decisions on behalf of an organization, what do I take away from these two competing visions for decision making, these two competing models to get better and better at making managerial decisions? So some other decision-making influences. We talked about politics and this political idea of a coalition. The political model of decision-making suggests that certain individuals or groups will influence others to achieve their goals. And in general, the political model attempts to develop coalitions to promote ideas, to obtain resources, or negotiate an advantage. And this could be an advantage either internal to the organization, you want more resources from the budget, or outside of the organization. So these decision-making models we give you because we think that they are helpful to help us as individual persons, as individual managers, to better understand what our existing process has been and how we can improve it. You see them here, table 7.1 from your textbook, reproduced here, right? And just, we want you to consider to what degree might some of these models be useful to you and to your organization. Where do you tend to fall historically? And if that's not really satisfactory to you, is there a better way for you to approach these decisions, either perhaps to give yourself more time or to more deliberately pursue greater and better, more perfect information, more complete information, to take better time to consider the alternatives, or perhaps to use a clearer model how you're evaluating the alternatives to begin with, rather than simply relying upon intuition. These are all very big topics, big matters for us to be able to do a better job, well, not only on behalf of our own careers, but of course on behalf of the organizations that have entrusted us with decision-making power. We hope that this has been helpful. We hope that you'll learned now how to contrast the real world model with the classic model and examine the many different individual behavioral elements that affect our individual decision making as human beings. We hope this is helpful. We hope this will help you as you consider your own habits, your own history, your own tendencies to improve, to get better at managerial decision making. Thanks so much for your attention. We'll see you in the next video.